Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. The video you're about to see is an interview with Raj Baskaran. He's a genetic counseling student at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. So hope you enjoyed the interview. All right, so would you mind just giving a brief intro of yourself to start off?
Sure. Yeah, so my name is Raj Baskaran. I'm a rising second year genetic counseling student at UNCG. And I guess some of my interests in the field are cancer genetics and lab and industry. And also trying to figure out which one of those would be a good fit for myself. You know, I just started my rotations. I finished my first rotation. And I guess you could say I'm pretty much in the thick of being a genetic counseling student at this point.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm interested in what you have to say about the industry side of things, because I feel like that's something that, at least personally, I haven't heard a lot of insight or experience from industry counselors. So would you mind telling me like how you gravitated towards that at all?
Yeah, so my main draw to the industry side is that it's very different from what I understand than the clinical side, where you know, clinical genetic counselors typically are working with patients on a day-to-day basis and are providing first-hand care, versus on like the laboratory and industry side, you're more focused on working with providers and commercial entities. So you know, from my perspective, making sure that commercial entities like large labs um, and companies that are administering genetic tests, they should also be really knowledgeable and you know, have some guidance, and genetic counselors can be the people to give that guidance to them to make sure that, you know, whatever tests that they're providing are going to be I guess you could say useful, accurate, you know, that they have all the right information, and so that we can answer questions for them as well. I haven't yet had the opportunity to really experience a lot of industry firsthand. I know we had a couple of experiences in the first semester where we went to a couple of lab tours and we learned a little bit about what goes on behind the scenes when we order genetic tests and things like that. And it was some really interesting stuff that I was able to witness. So that kind of sparked my interest, and I'm still learning a little bit about it as I go as well.
Okay, awesome. I mean, it definitely seems really important to have counselors kind of on the inside to make sure that their tests and their work is being represented by those companies for the other like clinical counselors. That's really awesome. I guess another question I have to start off with, like your experience in getting into grad school. What would you say, as a summary, is like the experiences you had from undergraduate that really made you a competitive candidate for graduate school?
Yeah, so for genetic counseling, I know a lot of programs have specific requirements that we have to meet. For UNCG, there is like more focus on advocacy training. I'm sure a lot of the programs have crisis counseling training that you have to do. Just I have had specific experience working with special education students in summer camps. Of course, I've had crisis counseling training, and I guess to set myself apart, I was really just trying to look for opportunities where I can get involved um, with other people. It's not necessarily has to be a genetic focus, but a lot of it is advocacy work. So it's speaking for other people, like understanding people, and speaking, you know, advocating on their behalf. If that makes sense.
All right, that's great. I remember seeing something about, which I didn't really think of because it seems like different programs do it differently, but on the UNCG site, um, they seem to make a clear distinction between their interpretation of advocacy versus like crisis counseling, whereas other schools seem to have it as the same thing, kind of, or like interchangeable. So,
Like I mentioned, it doesn't have to be specifically like clinically focused or, you know, focused with like medical things in general, but you know, community outreach, um, and just, you know, understanding a group and then speaking on their behalf, I guess is the easiest way I can put it. But there's like a lot of things that can fall into that category. And I actually helped in the process of making that video for the program. It's something that we made last year, to really, you know, get that out to candidates so that they can know that, yeah, we're looking for specifically two separate qualifications here, and it's not necessarily the same skills that transfer for both. And there is a distinction for sure.
okay, cool. Yeah, that's really great advice. You said you just finished up your first round of rotations, but would you mind saying like the kind of typical day of being a genetic counseling student, what that looks like?
Sure. So it definitely looks a little bit different in the first year than the second year. At UNCG, the first year is pretty didactic. And we get a lot of hands-on experience by going to observations and lab tours and seeing how genetic counselors do their daily process. But we also get a lot of the core substance of the cancer genetics and prenatal genetics, pediatric genetics, adult genetics. So what are all these fields about? How are they different from each other? How are they similar? What skills are transferable? We learn all of this basically in the first year. The second year is slated out to be more of a advanced skills kind of year where we hone the information that we have learned already in the first year. And a huge component of the second year is also doing these clinical rotations. So at this point in the summer, I finished my first rotation, but there are 4 more rotations that we do throughout the course of the second year. And that actually takes up the majority of our time. Classes are going to be only 1 day per week, but it's a fully loaded day. And everything we learn during that day is applicable to the rotation that we're currently in and the course in the future.
Okay, that's awesome. It seems like your program is a lot more focused on the hands-on kind of side of things.
I'd say it's a good balance. Most of the time we are in class and we're learning things through guest lecturers. So lecturers that are usually genetic counselors that are practicing in different healthcare facilities around North Carolina. They come and give their perspective and they kind of lecture on their specialty. And what that really adds up to is it's like, I guess you get a lot of different perspectives throughout the first year. And that's just amplified by the community outreach that we do through classes like genetics in the community. Just like those hands-on lab observations, we go to labs and see how they function. So they really try to give us like a well-rounded view of genetic counseling and all the information we need to get started in that first year.
Okay, that's great. Now, since you mentioned you've been doing some rotations, I don't know if you're allowed to disclose anything like this, but if you would be able to share it, is there any kind of observation you had or like a case you experienced that really stuck out to you and like a very memorable case or something that you really learned a lot from and what that entailed?
So without getting too specific, because of patient privacy, I'd say the cases that generally stand out to me are the ones where things go a little bit unexpected in the middle. As genetic counselors, we have time to see the patient, what they're coming in for, and to prep for their case. But a lot of times we find out that when we're in the case, in the session, there are other things that can come up. People are diverse, people are variable. We can't always predict what's going to happen in the session. So I've had cases where things don't usually go according to the agenda that we make, and being able to kind of think on your feet and adjust yourself to what the patient really needs in that moment is an important skill that I've been trying to learn, especially in this first rotation. It can be a little intimidating for sure, and I know it was for me, but it gets better with time, and it's a really highly transferable skill to be able to adapt on the spot. So those would be the cases that really stood out to me, where I was forced to kind of adapt on the spot and provide counseling based on what the patient needs rather than what I had expected to do.
All right, yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, that's definitely sounds, pretty challenging, but I guess that's the best way to learn, right? So,
of course, yeah, and it's hard because a lot of the things we do in the first year are kind of didactic and theoretical. So we're learning all these concepts, and we're learning all this information about all these indications. But it's when you go to apply it and you realize sometimes it just doesn't fit perfectly, and you have to adapt and kind of it is challenging, and it's something that I think as you do the rotations and observations and practice with genetic counselors, you get a hold of that a lot better.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question I have for you is just what drew you to the program you chose, ending up at UNCG?
Yeah, so a lot of people say this about UNCG. From what I've heard, is that UNCG is very psychosocially focused compared to other programs. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, because I've only been to UNCG. But that is one thing that a lot of people do point out about UNCG, like the fact that the school also places a heavy emphasis on community diversity and inclusion, and that psychosocial aspect during counseling as well. It seemed like the school really stressed, at least treated it as an equal component of being a genetic counselor than just learning all of the core concepts, which you'll get at any university. So to me, that aspect of UNCG was really compelling, because to me that meant that at the end of the day we would become more of a well-rounded genetic counselor. So I found that to be appealing.
So from my perspective as a prospective student, like still an undergrad, my only exposure to these schools has been like a couple info sessions and things like that, but also just going on their websites and talking to students. But as opposed to just like the preliminary research on the program like I have to do right now, um, I'm curious how your like the interview processes that you had as someone who's gone through the application process, how those interviews where you get a closer look with the program, like how that influenced your decision of where to go. If that makes sense.
For sure. Yeah, and it can, all the information we can get on paper on like the university websites, and you can look into it for hours and hours and hours. But I know I was really nervous during the interview process because I didn't know what to expect, as like a lot of applicants are. But once you get into the interview, you realize like the program is really here to find people who are a good fit, um, obviously. But in terms of, are you a genuine person? Are you doing these things because you are really interested in this, or are you trying to just search for a degree? You know what I mean? So it really comes down to that. That interview is actually a really important component. It's not 100% of the entire application. Obviously, you look at GPA and your advocacy, crisis counseling, all the other components that kind of lead up to making an application. But the interview gives you a really good sense for how the program director is, how the assistant program director is, how the other faculty are. Do they have kind of a good match with your own personality and your own interests? And that can vary from program to program depending on who is running the program. For me, I really felt like the program faculty were a good fit. They were really all personable. They were really interested in me when I did the interview process, and that helped me feel more interested in the program as well. And they're a wealth of knowledge. They'll always answer all your questions. And a lot of times you read all the information on the site, but hearing it directly from the program director is a different story. You can get a better understanding of what the program is really about. And for me, the interview process at UNCG was really nice. I was able to meet with the existing students as well, and they had shared like this camaraderie as a cohort, and it was really inspiring. And when I finally came to UNCG and I met my own cohort, we felt like that same kind of connection. So you can tell like there is definitely a factor of building a cohort that will synergize really well and help each other out and work together. So it is all a part of that component of the interview process where you can really tell who the person is face to face rather than just their statistics on a resume.
Okay, that's great. I definitely have heard that same sentiment of the program trying to build a cohesive cohort because I guess with the competitive nature of the programs and how people with seemingly great credentials can not get in on their first round or something, it might just come down to like the other people that the cohort already had going into it, and then just trying to make sure everyone like gels really well. But it's great that it works out to be such a good group of people.
Absolutely. And if you get to the interview process, it automatically means you're definitely qualified to be a genetic counselor. It's not anything against anyone who doesn't get into the program after that. It's like, as you mentioned, it is like a very competitive program, and there's a finite amount of resources the program has to, train 8 candidates. So making sure that the candidates are a cohesive unit is an important part of that as well. So that helps us more than anyone else.
Great. And before I forget, like you reminded me because of just the nature of your cohort and everything. Genetic counseling is just a really female-dominated field. So I'm curious what your perspective as another like man in the field is like, if that's how that's affected you at all.
Yeah. So a lot of the time it's something I don't really think about, and I do synergize really well with my cohort. So it's not something I'm constantly worried about. Like, am I going to be kind of isolated because I am a minority in the program? But there are some things like, for example, prenatal counseling, when you're speaking about, delicate matters with a patient who has just gone through a pregnancy and, if in case some complications may arise and you're a male discussing those things. And at least this is my perspective, and it might not be the same for every other male in the genetic counseling program. But it can be difficult to kind of do that because you don't have that first level of that first degree of connection where, when it's a female counselor speaking with another female patient, it might be easier for the two to synergize. And I haven't yet had my prenatal rotation yet, so I'm not sure how that would go. But I can say that it's something that, it can be easy to kind of think like, because you're a male in a genetic counseling field, that it can be isolating at sometimes, and you may feel like you might not click as well in the field, but it's completely up to you, and it's not necessarily true that that is the case. Being a male in the field, I've also realized that in every profession there are these barriers that you have to overcome. Whether in like I had my most recent cancer genetic rotation, I had we see a lot of patients that have cancers like ovarian cancer or cervical cancer, things like that, that are typically limited to females. But when you're in the moment and you're providing the counseling, when you have the knowledge behind it and you are personable and you're an advocate for your patient, that gender difference doesn't really matter as much. The patient will still have that connection with you. And in that moment, I never feel like I'm isolated or anything like that. So I don't know how, I guess a follow-up to that, so maybe I can help provide more insight, but have there been other specific instances where you've heard that being a male in the genetic counseling field has proved had to have some barriers or challenges?
I haven't heard anything specifically that would indicate it's a challenge, other than what you said, which definitely makes sense with the nature of some of the issues a patient would come for are related more to a female perspective. But yeah, I mean, besides those barriers that seem just kind of inherent, I don't think there's any reason you can't do it or that it wouldn't work out. But I just was very curious because I have not yet spoken to a male genetic counselor or genetic counseling student, so I was just very curious of your perspective on that.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I was the first or if there were others before me.
Yeah, you were.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, personally, I haven't felt any kind of isolation or anything like that. If anything, I've felt more support from my program faculty, making sure that I do feel comfortable in the position that I am. And it could just be me personally, but I have had there were no like significant barriers that I really identified because I'm a male in the program. If anything, I feel like I'm learning a lot from my cohort and from my faculty and from the patients that I see. So it is a good experience.
All right, well, it's definitely great to hear that.
Yeah, it shouldn't be a reason why any male should steer away from genetic counseling.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess another question is, what would you say is the most, like, your favorite or most rewarding aspect of being a genetic counseling student?
For being a student in genetic counseling, what is my most favorite or rewarding aspect? That's a great question. I have to think about that one. I mean, I just feel like really thankful to be in a position where I can be a student in a master's program that's so selective. So I'm trying to learn as much as possible on my way up to being a genetic counselor, and there's a lot of different aspects that make up that experience, right? And I'm not sure if like you're looking for this information, but we have the didactic portion. Obviously, when we go to classes, we learn all these things. We have the observation portion. We have these practices with genetic counselors. We have community outreach involved in the program. We have the capstone project. So there's like so many different parts of being a genetic counseling student. At times you can feel like you're really spread thin across all of them, and I'm definitely starting to feel that as the workload starts to ramp up. But it is a good experience regardless, and I'm just learning so many things, and it just feels like sometimes you're just passively absorbing all this information, and just being in this setting just helps you surmount the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the flip side, maybe this is a little easier to pinpoint, but what would you say is the most challenging part of being a genetic counseling grad student?
That's an easy question. Time management. It's always been my number one enemy, and I've been working on it since day one. But yeah, it can be easy to fall behind just because there's so many things. Like I mentioned, there's all these number of things going on at once. But that's where really communication with the faculty, communication with the cohort really saved me a lot. So another reason why it's important to make sure that the students in the cohort are really utilizing the services of the faculty, utilizing the cohort to kind of help themselves and help their own cohort. It's important to kind of have that connection, because if you're not comfortable with talking with your faculty, if you're not comfortable with talking with your cohort, it can be easy to get kind of, you might not be able to keep up as much. And that's just like a reality with the grad program. And it's true of any grad program, it's a lot of work from day one. And in the course of these 2 years, it's important to kind of keep that communication up with your faculty, make sure that you're checking in regularly, make sure, and UNCG specifically, I've noticed the faculty will always check up on you, making sure that you're doing okay. Are you meeting your deadlines? Or how do you feel in the moment? And a lot of self-reflection is involved in this process as well. So all that together just helps me grow. And I've been working on the time management for sure. It can be overwhelming at times, but I guess what I always say is, like, if there's something to do, it'll get done. It'll always get done by the end of the day. So just keep pushing forward.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you. And my last question, I guess there's kind of two components to it, or I guess depending on how, what comes to mind for you, maybe there's two different ways to think about it. But in terms of advice for someone like my position, about to apply, I'm wondering if any like major tips that come to mind, whether that's like on the one hand would be specifically with like an application material, like a personal statement, interview, something like that, or just a general like wisdom of your mentality maybe going into it.
Yeah, I'd say knowing who you are. I don't know if that's really vague, but if you know who you are, you know your strengths, know your limitations, coming into an interview process, going into rotations, just knowing what you can and can't do, knowing how you can improve, and working on that is a huge thing. And 2 years is a pretty limited time to kind of absorb a lot of information and practice, and become a genetic counselor. But being able to identify your own strengths and weaknesses, and working on the weaknesses and bolstering your strengths is an important part that helps you accelerate that process. So definitely coming into it, and this helped me a lot during the interview as well. I knew my own strengths, I knew my own limitations, I knew my interests, and being able to share that, communicate that with the faculty, they were able to see, this guy knows what he can do, what he can't do. This is where we can help him. We know this can work out, and that also led to my GA position as a media assistant for the university as well. So, know who you are, know your strengths, know your limitations, and express them.
Awesome, that's great advice. All right, well, yeah, thank you so much again, and best of luck with the rest of your rotations and classes and everything else.
No problem. Thanks, Ethan. Hopefully we can speak soon.
Absolutely. All right, have a good one, man.
All right, man. Take care.
All right, that was Raj Baskaran from UNCG. Hope you liked the interview. Let me know if you want more genetic counseling student perspectives as opposed to just the practicing counselors that I've been focusing on a little more. But you can let me know that in the comments, or anything else you'd like to see. But keep posted for more videos. We got more coming out. See ya.